I'll begin with a reading from the second chapter of the book. It opens at a funeral. The chapter is entitled The Lethal Hold of Drugs. And the epigraph to the chapter, the beginning quote, is by the great Egyptian novelist Naguib Mahfouz, who in his transcendently beautiful Cairo trilogy wrote the following words: "Nothing records the effects of a sad life so graphically as the human body. Service over, the mourners mingle in the parking lot for a while before going their separate ways. It's a bright, dazzling day, the first time this year the spring sun has shown its face in the Vancouver sky. I say hello to Gail, a native woman who's bravely approaching the end of her third month without cocaine. 87 days, she beams at me. I can't believe it. It's no mere exercise in willpower. Gail was hospitalized for a fulminant abdominal infection 2 years ago and had a colostomy to rest her inflamed intestines. The severed segments of bowel should have been surgically rejoined long before now, but the procedure was always cancelled because Gail's intravenous cocaine use jeopardized the chances of healing. The original surgeon has declined to see her again. I booked the OR for nothing at least 3 times, he told me. I won't take another chance." I couldn't argue with his logic. Nothing sways them, my patients, from the habit, not illness, not the sacrifice of love and relationship, not the loss of earthly goods, not the crushing of their dignity, not the fear of dying. The drive is that relentless. How to understand the death grip of drug addiction? What keeps Penny injecting after the spinal abscess that nearly made her paraplegic? Why can't Beverly give up shooting cocaine despite the HIV, the recurring abscesses I've had to drain on her body, and the joint infections that repeatedly put her in hospital? What could have driven Sharon back to the downtown east side in her suicidal habit after the 6 months getaway? How does she shrug off the deterrence of HIV and hepatitis, a crippling bone infection, and the chronic piercing pain of exposed nerve endings? Now, if human life was so simple that people learned from negative consequences, well then human history would be very different. This long tale of woe and misery and crimes and misdemeanors that we inflict upon each other would have stopped long ago. It's not true that people learn from negative consequences. Something else has to be there as well, and that something else is the subject of my talk tonight. But of course, many medical practitioners and governments, least of all, don't get that. They don't get it. They think that more negative consequences will lead to somehow to miraculous transformations. So what is the death grip of addiction? I'm not afraid of dying, a client told me. Sometimes I'm more afraid of living. And the real issue is, why are people so afraid of life as they know it that they have to obliterate their senses and their awareness with these powerfully damaging drugs? And that's the real question. And as long as we see drug addiction, or any addiction for that matter, as simply a failure of will, a weakness of character, a bad choice, a poor decision, we'll never understand what it's about. And from that position of misunderstanding, we can never help the addict. Dismissing addictions as bad habits or self-destructive behavior comfortably hides their functionality in the life of the addict, and that's Dr. Vincent Felitti, who's an American physician and researcher. So the issue is, what role does the addiction play in the addict's life? What is the actual value of the addiction? And we have to get that the addiction has value for the individual engaging in it. Now, yes, damaging in the long term, but addiction is all about the present moment, getting relief from the unbearable stress or discomfort of what one is experiencing in the moment. And there's no future considerations involved. Well, of course, what do the drugs do for people? Well, they're, of course, painkillers above all. I mean, the opiates are painkillers. So they soothe pain. But they don't only soothe physical pain, they also soothe emotional pain, because it turns out that the same structure in the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, that interprets the emotional significance of physical pain, also responds to and interprets the emotional significance of emotional pain. So when somebody says, "Oh, when he said that, that really hurt me," or "when they did that, that was like a stab in the heart," they're not just being metaphorical. That pain is felt in the same part of the brain. So drugs and all addictive behaviors are painkillers. And the question we have to ask is not why the addiction, but why the pain? Then, of course, there are self-medications for a whole host of conditions. I've become struck by the fact that whenever a client says to me, "Doc, when I do cocaine, I actually calm down with it," or "I do crystal meth and I feel calmer, not like everybody else who goes hyper," I know that person has ADHD. They're self-medicating their attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because I myself, when I was writing this book, was taking a stimulant, Dexedrine, because I have ADD. So it helps me calm down and to focus. So they're self-medicating their ADHD, which is a major risk factor for illness, for addiction. They're self-medicating depression. Cocaine raises serotonin levels in the brain, as does Prozac. They're self-medicating post-traumatic stress disorder, which most of them suffer from, for reasons you'll soon know. It's a stress relief. When people's cortisol level, cortisol is the body's stress hormone, rises, they're more likely to engage in addictive behaviors, because the addictive behaviors in the short term relieve stress for people. And of course, they're also answers to people's social problems. Loneliness. Cocaine will bring you out of yourself. You're more social. If you've been lonely and isolated all your life, that's a very powerful inducement. Crystal meth, you're a street kid, and you have no food, that's okay. Crystal meth will suppress your appetite. You don't have a place to sleep, that's okay. With crystal meth, you can stay up for several nights in a row. You have no social companionship because you're alienated from your family of origin or from your foster home. Crystal meth will give you a street community to connect with. So the drugs solve problems in people's lives in the short term. Of course, they create problems in the long term. Now, when it comes to why people have the pain, well, it's really clear. I don't have a single female patient in the downtown east side who wasn't sexually abused as a child, and I mean not a single one. And many of the men were sexually abused as well as children, and if they were not sexually abused, they were abused, abandoned, neglected in other ways. So these people have, I'm talking about the hardcore substance user in the downtown east side, has plenty of reason to feel pain such that most of us can't even imagine. And the stories are horrendous. I tell some of them in the book. I didn't choose them for their drama or spectacularly sordid nature. They're just run-of-the-mill stories of what happens to people as children. So they have every reason to require pain relief for a lifetime. When you look at the research, it shows you the same thing. There was a very well-conducted study in California, looked at 17,000 adults, 40% of whom had been to college, 50% had been to college, 30% had completed college. Amongst these 17,000 people, they looked at what they called adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. An adverse childhood experience was being sexually abused, being beaten, a parent who was beaten by the other parent, an addict in the family, a parent being jailed, and so on. If a male child had 6 adverse childhood experiences, his chance of becoming an injection substance user was 4,600% as great as that of a child who didn't have any of those experiences. So each adverse childhood experience exponentially raised the probability of intravenous drug use, as it did of overeating, as it did of nicotine addiction, alcoholism, and so on. So it's clear that addictions are powerfully related to adverse childhood experiences. It's not even controversial. And there's a common belief that the drugs themselves are so strong that the drugs induce the addictions, but it's not true. It's just not true. Most people given morphine don't become addicted to it. You have to give thousands of people morphine in a hospital setting for pain before one of them will become addicted to the morphine. Many more people try crystal meth than ever become addicted to it. Many more people try cocaine or heroin than become addicted to it. Many more people try smoking than become addicted to it. Which is not to say that these substances are not dangerous. But the point is, the substance by itself cannot induce the addiction. When the US Army came back from Vietnam, fully 20% of the GIs were addicted to heroin. A few years later, only 1% was. Which is to say a 95% remission rate, unheard of in addiction circles. If 5% of my patients quit using drugs, I'd be ecstatic. And here 95% of the GIs did. Why? Because the drugs themselves did not account for the addiction. the people that remained addicted were the ones who came from very dysfunctional homes in the first place. And for the most of them, it was simply the stress of that particular war that induced, and the availability of the drug, that induced the addiction. And so to understand why some people are susceptible to addiction, since clearly not everybody is, you have to understand something about the neurobiology, the brain biology of addiction. And it's clear now that some very essential brain circuits are involved in the addiction process. Some brain circuits without which human life would not be even conceivably possible. And these are the circuits that are taken over by the addiction process, or in which the addiction process develops. And what are these circuits? Well, there's the whole motivation and reward circuitry. We don't do anything unless we're motivated to do it. And this involves the chemical dopamine, the brain chemical dopamine. If you saw the movie Awakenings with Robin Williams, he plays a psychiatrist whose patients lack dopamine, and he gives them a drug that raises their dopamine levels, and these zombie-like creatures become alive and vibrant human beings, and when the drug stops working, they fall back into their zombie-like state. So without motivation and incentive circuitry, which is to say the circuitry of dopamine in the brain, there's no human life possible. Why does heroin work in the human brain? I mean, it's made from a poppy seed. Why does a poppy seed product have such a powerful function, a powerful effect on the brain cells of a human being? Well, only because there must be receptors for it. Without receptors, which are molecules on the surface of a brain cell, where a molecule can fit and trigger an interaction with the cell, nothing happens. That substance would be inert. So we must have heroin receptors. Well, do we have heroin receptors? No, we don't. We're not poppy seeds. What we have receptors for are for brain chemicals that are very similar to morphine and heroin, and those are the body's endorphins. Endorphin meaning endogenous morphine-like substances. So we have endorphin receptors, and the heroin and the morphine resemble our endorphins sufficiently so they fit into these receptors. But why do we have receptors for endorphins? Well, they're the pleasure chemicals. When people have a satisfying sexual or experience or eating experience, they have raised endorphin levels. You can block that with drugs that block heroin. So, do we then have these powerful endorphin circuits just so that we can have a good time on a Saturday night? No. The endorphins play an essential role in human life by relieving pain. Toddlers running around happily bumping themselves and not really complaining that much are probably fueled by high levels of endorphins at that stage of their lives. So endorphins relieve pain, as do heroin and morphine. What else do they do? Well, they modulate the immune system. They're involved in multiple functions throughout the body. They give us a sense of reward and pleasure, but most essentially for human survival, what the endorphins do is they make possible the bonding of human infant to parent. Without the endorphin circuitry, a mother or father will not feel tender towards the child. Without the endorphin circuitry, the child will not want to connect with the parent. If you rear infant rats in a laboratory, and you genetically knock out their endorphin receptors, these infant rodents will not vocalize distress when they're separated from the mothers. And you can imagine what that would mean in the wild. It would mean their death. Because the only thing that keeps the mammalian infant, human or otherwise, alive is the nurturing presence of the parent. And if the child is not upset when the separation occurs, the parent gets no signals to come to the child's support. So the endorphin circuitry is essential for love, basically. It's been called, the endorphins have been called molecules of love, which is what they are. So that circuitry is involved in addiction. The dopamine and incentive and the reward and the pleasure and the love circuitry of the endorphins. Then there is the circuitry of regulating emotions. As I've said, the drugs are antidepressants. Addicts don't know how to regulate their emotions. In other words, there needs to be a developed and mature mechanism in the human brain that'll keep things at an even keel so that whatever happens externally, there's a really even-tempered environment internally. So that even if bad things happen, I don't get all upset and become dysfunctional. And if good things happen, I don't become over-elated and manic about it. That's emotional self-regulation, affect regulation. It's called, those circuits don't function in the addicts, and you can show them on brain scans not functioning very well. And that means that the addict then uses the drugs to regulate their emotions. People who don't understand addiction often talk about it in terms of a choice. Well, there's not much choice involved, really. Most of the activities of the human brain don't come out of free choice. In fact, the impulses in the brain that make us do things tend to arise from the lower brain centers. And the cortex, the gray matter, the job of the cortex is not so much to initiate action as to inhibit it. So that there has to be circuits that are trained and developed to inhibit those impulses that are not appropriate to the situation. I mean, that challenge occurs to us many times a day when we might have an impulse that would not be appropriate, but we don't act it out because something there says, no, that's not appropriate right now. We don't do that. Our brain does that for us. The problem in addiction is not so much a question of free will, as somebody has said, but a free won't. The addict does not have the free won't. Can't say no. So for Nancy Reagan to put up billboards saying, just say no, ignores the brain biology of addiction. The addict does not have that impulse regulation circuitry. And finally, stress regulation. When you, as I mentioned, when people's cortisol or stress hormone levels rise, they're more likely to engage in addictive behaviors. If cortisol levels, if you infuse addicts with cortisol, their impulse to do cocaine increases. When you stress animals, they're more likely to engage in addictive behaviors. And in fact, the research literature shows very clearly that the biggest inducement and trigger for addictive behavior and relapse is stress. Now keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, because our whole social policy is based on stressing the addict. And then we hope to redeem them, which flies in the face of science, not to mention human compassion. So these listen, you guys, if you're going to applaud every time I say something smart, you're going to be applauding the whole evening. So you might just knock it off. Nobody's ever accused me of not being arrogant. So these four circuits then: the motivation, reward, love circuitry, the emotional self-regulation, the behavior inhibition, and the stress regulation circuitry of the brain are seriously out of whack in addicts. Another question is why? Now, many people believe that this is a genetic problem. You know, if there's drinkers in a family, and if you start to drink, well, that means that it's a genetic problem. Nothing is further from the scientific truth. Because when something runs in a family, it doesn't mean it's genetic. You can pass on certain traits biologically without genes, by affecting the child's hormonal makeup, for example, early in childhood, by modeling certain behaviors, by imposing stresses on the child. You can actually affect their behavior and their brain development without any genetic input. So family histories are meaningless when it comes to genetic causation. Then you have to get into the esoterica of twin studies and adoption studies. And in a moment, you'll find out why those are totally useless in defining a genetic basis to addiction. Because it turns out that the human brain, and this is not my theory, I'm just telling you the gospel truth as far as current brain science is concerned, it's not even controversial. What makes it controversial is only that it's not taught in the medical schools yet. You know? And it reminds me of The Wizard of Oz, you know, when the straw man is looking for a brain. Remember what the wizard says to him at the end? He says, there's lots of people out there who are lecturing and writing books who have no more brains than you do. But what they have that you don't is a diploma. So I'm going to give you a diploma, you know? Unfortunately, the stuff I'm telling you, even though it's accepted brain science now, and has been for a couple of decades at least, is not yet entered the criteria or the curricula of most or any medical school that I know of. But the fact is that the human brain develops in interaction with the environment. And why is that? Well, and genes are turned on and off by the environment. Well, the human brain is the largest brain of any mammal, and yet when we're born with the least mature brain of any mammal. A horse can run on the first day of life. A human being can't muster that degree of neuromuscular coordination, visual acuity, and balance and strength until 1.5, 2 years. So the horse is 2 years ahead of us at birth in terms of brain development. And that's because as human beings our progenitors began to use the digits as hands, the forepaws as hands, the brain underwent a tremendous expansion in order to control, manipulate, and plan the actions of the hands. So now we're having a larger brain. At the same time, we start walking on 2 legs, so the pelvis has to narrow to accommodate the 2-legged stance. Narrow pelvis, large head. What does nature have to do? Well, nature says, listen, kid, I'll let you have a large brain and a narrow pelvis, but you're going to have to get out of there very quickly. Because if anybody waited much longer in the uterus than 9 months, nobody would ever get born. It's that simple. And those of you who have given birth or have seen a birth, you know that the head is the largest part of the body already at birth. But still, most of brain development occurs after birth. In fact, 80% of the increase in the size of the brain occurs after birth and not before. And most of that happens in the first 3 years of life. So by the end of the 3rd year of life, the human body is 19% adult size, but the human brain is 80% adult size. So there's a tremendous expansion of brain circuits in the first few years of life. And it happens under the impact of the environment. Those circuits that get the appropriate input will develop properly, and those that don't simply will not develop or may even atrophy and die. If you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room and he never sees light for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life. Because the circuits of vision require light waves in order to promote their development. In the absence of light wave, the brain says, why should I put this energy into visual circuitry? I might as well put it into another faculty like hearing or smell or touch. So the critical period for vision is over at age 5. Now, it turns out that the circuitry of emotional self-regulation, of impulse inhibition, of the reward and motivation circuitry, and the stress regulation circuitry also requires the right environmental conditions. And what is that? It's the presence of an emotionally involved, consistently available, non-stressed parenting caregiver. And without that condition, that child's brain will not develop properly. And you can do this with monkeys. You can separate monkeys from their mothers a bit earlier. You'll find characteristic changes in their brains from those monkeys who were brought up by their mothers. You can do this with rats. And it turns out that not only after birth is the presence of the caregiver essential, but already during intrauterine life, the emotional states of the parent have an impact on the brain development of the child. After 9/11, there was a study that showed that women who were pregnant at the time of the collapse of the trade towers, the World Trade Towers in New York, those women who were pregnant and suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, when they were infants, cortisol or stress hormone levels were measured at 1 year of life. Depending on what stage of pregnancy the woman was at, when she suffered the PTSD, that child would have abnormal cortisol levels at 1 year of age. Mothers who are depressed in the first year of life, their infants will have abnormal cortisol levels at 3 years of age. There was a study of electroencephalograms, the EEGs of the infants of depressed mothers with postpartum depression at 6 months of age. They could tell from the electrical readout of the infant's brain whose mother was depressed and whose wasn't. So stress on the parenting environment from uterus onwards has an impact on the child's brain development. You can stress animals in the laboratory. You can expose rats to a loud noise for 10 minutes once a week. In the second trimester, those infant rats, when they grow up, will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol. Having understood which, you get to see why adoption studies are useless and twin studies are useless, because they're all based on the assumption that the environment that shapes the child begins only after birth. But no, it doesn't. And so any woman who's going to have to give up a baby for adoption is by definition a stressed woman. If she wasn't stressed, she would not have to give up the baby, would she? She's a single mom, she's an addict perhaps, she's an abused woman, she's a young teenager, but something is stressing her. And that means for 9 months, the hormones of stress, cortisol and adrenaline, are going through that infant's body, through the placenta, to the infant. And we know, for example, from a recent British studies, that women who are abused during pregnancy, at 7 or 8 years of age, their children have a much higher chance of being diagnosed with developmental disorders. So these adoption studies, in their assumptions that the environment only begins after birth, there's no basis to that. And as a matter of fact, well, I could go on about adoption, I won't, but the point is that most of brain development occurs under the influence of the environment, under the impact of environmental stress. Now, when you go back and recall what I said about the childhoods of my downtown East Side patients, not only do they not have the right conditions for development, they have positively the wrong conditions for development. Because the very people who are supposed to be providing the care are the ones who are themselves so troubled, multi-generationally so, that they cannot but help inflict trauma on the child. That's what happens. Now, you might immediately say to yourself, well, how about people who weren't abused but they still become addicts? Well, first of all, most people who become hardcore substance users were abused. That's just a statistical and practical fact. But there's another issue here, which is that two things can go wrong in childhood. One, when something that shouldn't happen happens, such as abuse, and one, when things that should happen don't happen. And what doesn't happen, even in the absence of abuse, in many families in our culture, is the presence of a non-stressed, emotionally present caregiver. And just consider what kind of a father I was when I was a workaholic doctor. And what was important to me, if you had asked me what my values were, I would have said my highest value is the well-being of my children. I would have thrown myself into a fire for my kids. But the problem was, nobody ever needed me to throw myself into a fire. They just needed me to be home as a present, emotionally available caregiver. That I didn't do because my mind was on the beeper. And why isn't it going? Aren't I important? And these stresses are multiplying in our society. And so our youth are at risk, not because of any innate genetic problem. If you look at this problem of overeating, 30% of North American kids are now considered morbidly overweight. It's an addiction. And it's not about the availability of fast foods and a sedentary lifestyle. It's about the fact that kids are stressed and they use food as a stress reduction, and particularly greasy foods reduce stress much quicker than sweet foods do. So it's an addiction problem with our kids based on the fact that they're stressed because their parents are so stressed. There was a study a couple of months ago that showed that women who are stressed or depressed are more likely to have kids with asthma. And how do we treat asthma? With stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. Those kids' stress mechanism has been exhausted, the subject of another book of mine. But more to the point with youth, there's something else that's going on, which I briefly allude to. I can't go into a long spiel about it now, but it's the subject of a book I co-wrote with a friend of mine, the psychologist Gordon Neufeld. It's called Hold On to Your Kids. And it's about the fact that in our culture, there's something aberrant going on. Children used to grow up in a network of nourishing adult attachments, the so-called village, the clan, the tribe, the community, the neighborhood, the extended family. So it never was the case that this harassed nuclear family was responsible for the upbringing of children. No, it takes a village. It takes a whole village of nurturing adults. Now, for economic and social reasons beyond any particular individual's control, in the last 70 years or so, that's really been destroyed for most of our kids. I mean, our kids are lucky if their grandparents are even within driving distance, let alone within walking distance. And that means that all the stress is on the parents. But what's the situation with the parents? Very often two parents have to work now to make a living. And what does that mean? The human brain has to connect with somebody, especially the immature human brain has to connect with somebody, because it can't stand a lack of connection because of our helplessness as infants and children. So it's instinctual to connect with whoever's around. And it's just like the duckling who prefers to imprint on mother duck, but when the mother duck is not there, will imprint on anything that moves. And who do our children imprint upon? Who's around. And who's around? The peer group. So our kids imprint upon each other. And once they do, they become each other's models and cue givers on how to be, how to walk, how to talk, how to act. And in that environment, children are unsafe, so they shut down emotionally, they suffer a lot of pain. Now they can do drugs like stimulants to be more alive and more alert. Our kids are so bored because they're so deadened to their own emotions. And why they're deadened to the emotions? Because they lost the contact with the nurturing adults, not because the parents are bad parents, but because our culture no longer supports the parenting task, and we no longer give our kids that village, which is another big driver of addiction. And literature shows that a major risk factor for addiction is peer orientation. Kids who are oriented to their peers. And that subject is discussed in Hold On to Your Kids. And so then, I'll leave substance addiction for a moment, and I'll just say something that, even when it comes to behavioral addictions, it's not any different. When I engage in my shopping addiction for classical compact music, and there's always tittering when I say that, and justifiably so, but let me tell you, one week I spent $8,000 on the things. $8,000. And it's not that I'd made a decision that I'm going to spend $8,000 on, say, classical music. No. I went to the store, and I had to go back 2 hours later. And then I had to go back 3 hours later. And you know, there's a spiritual teacher who said that just one more is the binding factor in the cycle of suffering. Well, every time I got my latest set of Beethoven symphonies, oh, well, I got to get that other one. And I'd be momentarily satisfied, not by the purchase, but you know what I was satisfied by? Because the purchase for me triggers the same release of dopamine and endorphins in the brain that the drug addict is after. So every behavior addiction employs and utilizes and exploits exactly the same circuits. And I had to have it right now. Tomorrow wasn't enough. This afternoon wasn't enough, to the point where I once left a woman in labor to go get a piece of music. And of course, I still could have made it back in time to the hospital, but once you're in the store, you can leave. And besides, there are these evil classical music pushers lurking in the aisles, you know, who want to sell you more Mozart and more Beethoven and more Mahler, you know. The behavior addicts are after the same hit of their own brain chemicals. And whether that's sex or gambling, whether it's food, whether it's shopping, they've done scans, brain scans of shopping addicts, or people who are in compulsive shopping, the same circuits light up as with the drug addict. There's only a universal addiction process, which means, folks, that we live in a very addicted society. Because if you define addiction, as I do, as a behavior that you crave and relapse into, despite the negative consequences, then we live in a very addicted society. We're so addicted that we're destroying the earth for the sake of temporary pleasure. That's what we're doing. What is our social addiction to a certain mode of living and acquisition compared to the petty addictions of my downtown East Side patients in terms of the social harm being done? Which then brings up the question, why do we marginalize and ostracize the drug addict? Precisely because we don't want to look at ourselves. They act out for us in a very clear and stark and extreme way our own internal compulsions, our internal lack of proper lack of behavioral inhibition, our internal lack of self-regulation, where we're looking to and we're enjoined and propagandized into looking to the outside in order to soothe a void, an emptiness, and a pain inside of ourselves. And so we make the addict into the scapegoat. In our society, we also have to say that it's a social issue. Now, it's very clear. Animal studies have been done on this. If you put monkeys into situations where you isolate them socially, their levels of dopamine receptors in the brain will go up, and they'll want to do more cocaine. And if you stress animals by making them subordinate to other animals, they all want to do more cocaine. So it's a question of social influence as well, which then immediately answers the question as to how come that 30% of the clients that I deal with in the downtown East Side are First Nations people, whereas they only make up 1 or 2 or 3% of the Canadian population. And why 50 or 60% of our jail population is made up of First Nations people. Because nobody has been dominated more in our society than the First Nations people. Their culture has been taken away, their lands have been taken over, their way of life has been destroyed, their spiritual values have been denigrated, and their power has been denied to them. And so we keep creating the conditions for addiction, of course, and not to mention the currently hot issue of the sexual abuse in these residential schools, where a native person who wanted to resist his child being taken away this is a generation ago, could actually be jailed in Canada. It only stopped in 1981. And when some natives asked for their children to at least spend a month with them every year in the summertime, the government and the church refused that to them, so that these kids could be kept in institutions where they were serially abused. Do we wonder then that that trauma is being passed on from one generation to the next? And do we wonder then why the HIV infection rate amongst Aboriginal people in the downtown east side is double that of non-First Nations people? So we have ourselves to look to for creating conditions that foster addiction and for not creating conditions that would redeem addictions. And what would redeem addiction? What would redeem addiction? Well, guess what? What's needed to redeem addiction are the same circumstances that would have had to have been there to prevent it in the first place, which is some loving, compassionate, nurturing attention. Because only, as a spiritual teacher that I respect once said, only in the presence of compassion will people allow themselves to see the truth. If you want the addict to get the truth of his life, be compassionate towards him or her. Then people can be free. But as long as they're getting judged and rejected and ostracized and impoverished and jailed, all you're doing is stressing them, which we know is the biggest driver of addictive behavior. There's this so-called war on drugs. There is no war on drugs. You can't wage a war on inanimate objects. There's a war on drug addicts is what there is in this country. And let me just read you something that I think, in my mind at least, shows up the absurdity of it all, at least the, well, let me call it absurdity. This is a Toronto story. Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's sex crimes unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. And the Goldman Mail wrote, Paul Gillespie still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain in the graphic videos of children being raped and molested that he has seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. They're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in these pictures. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. Now, why do children's eyes go dead? It's physiological. Vulnerability, from the Latin word vulnerare, to wound. Human beings are profoundly vulnerable. There's nothing the brain can do to protect us from our vulnerability. We can be wounded physically and emotionally, but the brain has to protect us from the overwhelming sense of vulnerability, the awareness of it, because we can't function. We simply are paralyzed by anxiety and fear in a state of total vulnerability. So what the brain shuts down is awareness of emotion. Awareness of emotion. So now we become a little bit deadened. Our eyes go dead. And once we do, we need to do stimulants to feel alive again, don't we? And when the pain spills over, and it still spills over because even the emotional shutdown is not enough to kill all the pain, then we do the opiates. And the sex trade worker who has since died of HIV once said to me when I asked her what her initial experience of heroin was, she said, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug, which is exactly the mother experience that she never had. So then I write, Dead Eyes, Broken Spirits. In a phrase, this compassionate man summed up the fate of the abused child. Yet there's a bitter irony in his words. The lives of abused children do not end when they are rescued, if they are rescued, as most never are. Many become teenagers with spirits not mended and reach adulthood with eyes still dead. Their fate continues to be a concern for the police and the courts, but by then they're no longer heartbreakingly sweet, no longer vulnerable looking. They lurk on the social periphery as hardened men with ravaged faces, as thieves, robbers, shoplifters, as done-up prostitutes selling backseat sex for drugs or petty cash, as street corner drug pushers or small-time entrepreneurs distributing cocaine out of cheap hotel rooms. And it's still the job of the police to be concerned with them, but now as miscreants and criminals. What's the result? The result is that we're punishing people for having been abused in the first place. That's what we're doing. And, you know, in a society where, the point has been often made before, but you know how many people die around the world every year from tobacco smoke? 5.5 million. As many people are killed every year by tobacco smoke, which is sold freely and publicly, which is advertised openly and profitably, as many people die every year as died in the 5 years of the Nazi genocide of Eastern European Jewry. The people who sell those products are respectable members of our society. My drug-addicted patient who sells half an ounce of cocaine in the street to support his habit gets thrown to jail. What sense are we making? So in the context of this war against these people, there's nothing that could be done to redeem large numbers of them, which is not to say we shouldn't try. But the conditions for trying are still to try and give them what we can by way of compassion. And that brings us to harm reduction. Now, I'm closely associated with the safe injection site in Vancouver, which has recently been in the news. I work at On-Site at present, which is the detox facility right above Insight. So my clients at On-Site come from Insight, which is a supervised injection site. The federal health minister, Tony Clement, told a health committee last week in Ottawa that Insight safe injection is not medicine, he said, because it does not heal addiction. Well, I've written an op-ed piece for the Globe that I think will be published tomorrow. I make a very simple point. It's true. Safe injection site does not heal addiction. It's not designed to. It's simply designed to first reduce the harm by reducing the risk of disease transmission. Number two, to reduce the harm by having people there who can resuscitate you if you overdose. But as to not, so he's right about that. It doesn't heal addiction. But is he right that it's not medicine? Well, what the heck does the health minister think we're doing when we give a smoker Ventolin or cortisol inhalers to open up their airways? Are we curing their addiction, or are we simply reducing the harm? When a stressed, workaholic, type A business executive shows up in the emergency ward with a heart attack, what are we doing when we give him a quadruple bypass? Healing his workaholism or simply reducing the harm? When we give people insulin for diabetes, which they develop because they haven't exercised enough, or they're too stressed, they're eating a lot, now we give them insulin. Are we curing their addiction or reducing the harm? So, I mean, it's again, Tomislav suggested that the space between us and them, if we didn't see it as them, if we see that what we're doing all throughout medicine is all about harm reduction. We can't cure most diseases. Medical science, Western medical science, has got no idea how to cure most diseases. What we do is reduce the harm from the disease process. So that's what we're left with. But there's another great value to the harm reduction process, which goes beyond just reducing the harm. It also means that for many of these people, harm reduction is the first contact they've had with healthcare givers who actually treat them without judgment, with compassion, and with a supportive attitude. You have no idea, unless you've seen it with your own eyes, what that means to people who all their lives have known nothing but abuse or self-abuse. And if there's any possibility in human beings for transformation, which there is, always, because it's been well shown now that the brain can develop new circuits at any stage in life, despite early damage. But the conditions have to be right. So if we're truly compassionate, we have to provide the conditions for development. And that, as Bruce Perry said, and Bruce Perry is the senior fellow at the Houston Child Trauma Academy. He's a child psychiatrist, and he's a former head of mental health services for children and youth in Alberta. It's corny, he said, but we have to give people a lot of love, is what he said. Now, that's not a word that we use in medicine now, do we? Because you can't prove in a double-blind study that love even exists. But we can sure show the absence of it. You know, people who, the study at Harvard University showed that undergraduates who didn't perceive themselves as being close to their parents at age 20 were far more likely to be sick in middle age. So we may not be able to prove the existence of love, but we sure see its effects when the love didn't get through to the child. And one of the major effects we see that is in addiction. In terms of how to work with addicts, and I do talk in the book about the healing of non-drug addictions as well, which is a lot easier because these people are not as traumatized and they have more at stake. But focusing on the drug addict here tonight, it takes a lot of awareness on the part of the caregiver You see, it's very easy to judge these people. The human mind is a judgment factory. So you don't judge people. You're not actively judging people. Your mind does, automatically. You look at something, you immediately have a reaction to it. We're reaction machines. And a lot of those reactions have to do with judgments. When you look at judgments, they're always about ourselves. When am I most judgmental of my drug-addicted patients? When is it that I can't stand their weakness and their repetitive falling into negative behaviors, when the consequences are so clear? When I'm indulging in my compact disc addiction, when I'm lying to my wife, you know, I come home, did you buy any compact discs today? Oh no. And next morning, I'll use my medical authority to be harsh on some drug addict who won't give it up and who will lie to me about it. Imagine lying. So I'm judgmental most when I'm not looking after myself. And in emergency wards and hospital corridors, I've so often seen situations escalate, not because of the behavior of the drug addict, but because the healthcare provider got too triggered. We have our triggers, we're human beings too. And how do we deal with that? We become mindful of our own reactions and we take responsibility for that. You see, here's the thing. Who are we to the drug addict? We're caregivers. What does caregivers represent in the mind of the addict? An abuser. Because their first experience of caregivers was an abusive one. And there's two kinds of memory. And again, this is something that ought to be taught in the medical schools. There's two kinds of memory. There's explicit memory, which is recall. Recall is when you can call back the circumstances and the episodic details of something that happens. Now the structures of like what you had for breakfast today, what you watched on TV last night, the circuits of the brain that encode explicit memory or recall aren't even developed until the second or third year of life, which is why none of us recall anything before then. But there's another kind of memory called implicit memory. And implicit memory is the neurological imprint of emotional experiences. And where are they imprinted? In the same circuitry that regulates impulses, here in the front of the brain, in the right orbitofrontal cortex. And so, a child whose memory of caregivers was one of abuse, and I speak in a harsh tone to them because I didn't have breakfast that morning, and I'm irritable, for him the implicit memory of the abusive authority figure gets triggered. And now he's not talking to me, he's talking to his father, and he's either enraged or he's afraid. So I have to be aware of my own states if I'm going to interact with these people. It takes a lot of awareness, and it's a lot of work, and it's internal work that we have to take on if we're going to put ourselves into those situations. Finally, I'll end by saying that above all, or not above all, but underneath all perhaps, addiction is also very much a spiritual question, because the addict feels very alone in the world. It doesn't matter what the addict's former beliefs are. Formally, he may believe in God, he may believe in this religion or that religion, but in practice, he's got no faith at all. Belief and faith are not the same thing at all. Fundamentally, the governing belief of the addict is I'm alone in the world, there's nobody to take care of me, and I can't possibly endure another moment without this particular relief. Now, that's a spiritual issue, in the sense that if we were connected with others, with our own higher self, with whatever is universal in the universe, who could possibly feel alone? So, either in the healing of addiction of ourselves or other people, we cannot neglect the spiritual dimension, and by which I don't mean any kind of religious prescription. So to summarize then, I fully believe that if we understood addiction, its universality, its utter humanity, the suffering that gives rise to it, and the suffering that it imposes, and if we actually put our hearts and our brains and our compassion and our scientific knowledge together, we would not only be providing much better care for addicts, we'd be living in a much more humane and compassionate society. Thank you.
Dr. Mate, can you say anything about the recent literature that's come out about brain plasticity?
Well, thank you for the question. As I mentioned, there's plenty of research now, and I referred to in the book, that shows that the proper conditions and the proper mental training can actually result in new circuitry in the brain. and that's called neuroplasticity. It's been shown in animals. You can take rats at any age, rats that are damaged at birth deliberately, geriatric rats, and you give them better conditions to live in, they will not only exhibit more intelligent behavior a month or two later. If you autopsy them and look at their brains, they'll have richer nerve supply, richer blood supply, larger nerve cells, and more connections in their frontal cortex. And we've known for a lot of reasons, and of course there's that well-known book, The Brain That Changes Itself, by Norman Doidge, that talks about this very fact. And this is what gives us hope. But the point is, since we're talking about development here, if you were asking yourself, how does a plant develop? I mean, you know, if a plant was stunted in your backyard, you could have two choices. You could either give it the conditions that it needs, or you can go and yell at it and tell it to grow up already. So if we want to promote neuroplasticity, we have to provide the right conditions. Most medical students, including most psychiatrists, never learn normal human psychology. They learn pathology. And we tend to look at people from the point of view of disease. Somebody comes in with a symptom. Our job is to fix the symptom. Our job is to try and cure the disease. We either burn it out, or we cut it out, or we kill it somehow. But that's our perspective. It's a very non-holistic. We don't look at the individual in context. We don't learn about family development. We don't look about multi-generational trauma. None of this stuff is taught. So what is taught instead is the disease model of understanding human beings. Categorizing people according to symptoms, calling that a disease, and then seeing what we can do about that. That's the model that's essentially taught. Now, there have been some strides to get away from that, you know, at various medical school universities, and it's better than it was than when I went to medical school. But still, it's woefully lacking. And on the other hand, we're taught some stuff that's utterly useless in incredible detail. I mean, I once asked a neurologist, a practicing neurologist, when I was in fourth year medical school or third year, and I was studying neuroanatomy. I said, well, Dr. McFadden, how much of this stuff do you use? He says, maybe about 20%. So we load medical students with a lot of detail, a lot of stress, and we don't give them, you know, doctors used to practice, when they didn't have science, they had to use their wisdom. And Dr. William Osler was a great Canadian physician, and, you know, still looked upon as a sort of a demigod of international medical teaching, who lived in the late 19th century, early 20th century. He said a lot of things that since have been proven by science, but he didn't have the science then, he just had the wisdom. Well, we used to have wisdom without science. Now we have a lot of science without wisdom. OxyContin, which is a synthetic narcotic, was marketed by its pharmaceutical manufacturer as a narcotic that's not addictive or not as addictive as other narcotics, knowingly that that wasn't true. So a crusading district attorney in the United States actually took this company to court. Rudy Giuliani and his consulting company tried to step in to stop the court action, but didn't succeed. And so last year the company paid $800 million. Wish they could pay out of their left pocket. They make, their profit was more than those of the next 5 industries put together. They sell $1 billion worth of OxyContin every year. Whole villages in Appalachia, according to the New York Times, were wiped out because of overdoses due to OxyContin. And these executives did not spend a second of jail time. So we live in a society of, I mean, talk about drug pushers. So we live in a society of immense contradiction. And as one expert I spoke to said that the war on drugs is cultural schizophrenia. It's like we're split. When you make big bucks at it, you're a hero, and when you make little bucks at it, you're a villain. And thank you very much for your attention.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.